April 3rd, 1814, and the season had begun with all its glittering promise for those who possessed the fortune to hope, though Eleanor Sinclair had long since abandoned such foolish notions as she stood in the shadows of Hartwick House's magnificent ballroom, her dove-grey gown rendering her nearly invisible against the pale silk wall coverings, while hundreds of candles blazed overhead in crystal chandeliers that scattered light like fallen stars across the polished floor, where young debutantes in white muslin twirled with eligible gentlemen and mammas in jewel tones watched with calculating eyes. And she felt the familiar ache of standing outside a world she had once briefly inhabited before Edward Sinclair's death had revealed the mountain of debts he had concealed behind charming smiles and tender words, leaving her at 26 with nothing but her wits and the pearl earrings her mother had pressed into her palm on her wedding day, the only valuable possession she had managed to keep when creditors had stripped everything else away like vultures picking clean the bones of her former life. Lady Harriet Pembroke shifted beside her on the gilt chair positioned against the wall where companions and chaperones gathered like grey ghosts at the feast. The elderly widow's kind face creased with the discomfort of rheumatism that plagued her in the cool spring evenings, and Eleanor adjusted the shawl around her employer's thin shoulders with practiced care while keeping her expression carefully neutral, even as something deep within her chest tightened at the sight of so much joy she was forbidden to claim. She had learned to make herself useful and unobtrusive, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to smile at appropriate moments and remain silent at others, and she had nearly perfected the art of wanting nothing when a sudden hush rippled through the ballroom like wind across wheat, and she looked up to see what had captured society's fickle attention. He stood in the doorway like a dark specter at a wedding, tall and broad-shouldered, in immaculate evening clothes that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it, his face carved from shadows and secrets, and even from across the vast room Eleanor could feel the dangerous energy that emanated from him like heat from a forge. The whispers reached her moments later, carried on perfumed breath and fluttering fans, as Mrs. Frances Langley leaned toward her companion with barely concealed delight at having such delicious intelligence to share. "The Duke of Thornbury," they murmured. "Alexander Ravenscroft himself, the man who had ruined 3 gentlemen in duels and destroyed countless others through means far less honorable, the man whom society both courted and feared in equal measure, the man incapable of love, who viewed people as possessions to be acquired or obstacles to be eliminated." Eleanor watched him scan the room with eyes that held no warmth, no interest, no humanity that she could discern from this distance, and she told herself firmly that men like him existed in a different world entirely from women like her, that she should look away and tend to Lady Harriet and forget she had ever noticed him at all, even as something inexplicable kept her gaze fixed upon his dark form and her heart beating with an anticipation she refused to name. The hour crept forward, and Eleanor remained at her post beside Lady Harriet, fetching cups of ratafia and adjusting shawls and pretending that her gaze did not drift repeatedly toward the terrace doors where the Duke of Thornbury stood in splendid isolation, his dark figure a stark contrast against the golden light spilling from within, and she chastised herself silently for such foolishness, because what possible interest could a man of his station and reputation hold for a woman in her position? Yet still her eyes betrayed her, drawn to him like moths to dangerous flame, even as the whispers around her painted portraits of a man she should fear rather than find fascinating. Mrs. Frances Langley had positioned herself near the refreshment table, her voice carrying just enough to reach Eleanor's ears as she regaled her companions with tales of the Duke's many transgressions, the duel with Lord Pemberton that had left that gentleman fleeing to the Continent in disgrace, the financial ruin of Sir Harold Whitmore, who had dared to cross him in a matter of business, the broken engagement that had scandalized society just 3 seasons past, when Lady Georgiana Crawford had thrown him over for reasons that remained shrouded in delicious mystery. As if summoned by the mere mention of her name, the lady herself swept into the ballroom in a gown of emerald silk that caught the candlelight like liquid envy, her golden curls arranged in elaborate perfection, her beauty so pronounced that conversations faltered and gentlemen straightened their cravats. And Eleanor watched as Georgiana's cool blue eyes found Alexander across the crowded room and dismissed him with a cutting little smile before she turned her radiant attention to the cluster of admirers already forming around her magnificent person. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Eleanor observed Alexander's face for any sign of pain at seeing his former betrothed, any flicker of the heartbreak that must surely linger after such a public rejection. But his expression remained as impenetrable as granite, his dark eyes scanning the swirling dancers with what appeared to be nothing more than ontad indifference, and she found herself wondering what manner of wound could transform a man into something so cold and distant that even the sight of lost love provoked no visible response. She had moved closer to the column near the refreshments to better attend Lady Harriet's request for a small plate of delicacies when it happened, when his restless gaze completed its circuit of the room and landed upon her with an impact she felt in her very bones. And for one endless moment that stretched between heartbeats, the Duke of Thornbury looked directly at Eleanor Sinclair, as though seeing through the dove-grey invisibility she had so carefully cultivated, as though recognizing something in her that she herself had forgotten existed. And she could not breathe, could not move, could not look away from those fathomless dark eyes that held her pinned like a butterfly beneath glass. Until finally, mercifully, someone passed between them and broke the spell, leaving Eleanor trembling and confused, and telling herself firmly that it had meant nothing at all, that men like him did not truly see women like her, that the connection she had imagined was merely a trick of candlelight and her own starved heart inventing significance where none existed. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The hour had grown late enough that the initial frenzy of arrivals had settled into the comfortable rhythms of established entertainment, and Eleanor had nearly convinced herself that the moment of eye contact with the Duke had been nothing more than coincidence, a random convergence of glances in a crowded room that her foolish heart had invested with meaning it did not possess, when she became aware of a presence at her elbow, and looked up to find a gentleman she did not recognize standing before her with an expectant smile upon his handsome face. He was tall and fair, where the Duke was dark, his blue coat adorned with gold buttons that caught the candlelight as he executed a bow of surprising elegance for a man addressing a mere companion, and when he spoke his voice carried the warm confidence of one accustomed to being welcomed wherever he chose to bestow his attention. Lord Thomas Ashford, he introduced himself, and he had observed her from across the room and found himself quite unable to resist requesting the honor of the next dance, if she would be so gracious as to accept. And Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with confusion because gentlemen did not ask companions to dance. Gentlemen looked through companions as though they were furniture, and yet here stood this golden viscount with his hand extended and his smile unwavering, while Lady Harriet nodded her permission with an expression of bemused encouragement. The whispers began before Eleanor even reached the dance floor, the other companions and chaperones exchanging shocked glances behind their fans as the widow Sinclair took her place among the dancers as though she belonged there, as though she had any right to stand beside debutantes in their white muslin and diamonds when she wore dove-grey and her mother's pearls. And Eleanor felt their judgment like heat upon her skin even as the music began, and her feet remembered steps she had not danced since before. Edward's death had stripped away every pleasure she had once known. She moved through the figures with a grace she had forgotten she possessed, her body recalling the lessons of her youth when she had been Miss Eleanor Fairfax with prospects and possibilities stretching before her like sunlit paths, and Lord Thomas guided her with gentle competence, while speaking of inconsequential things that required little response, allowing her to lose herself in the simple joy of movement and music. She did not see Alexander Ravenscroft watching from his position by the terrace doors, did not notice how his dark eyes followed her every turn with an intensity that had nothing of boredom in it now, did not observe the way his gloved hand tightened around his glass until the crystal threatened to crack beneath the pressure of his grip. But others noticed and whispered about that too, about the dangerous Duke who had shown no interest in anything all evening, suddenly unable to look away from the grey-clad companion dancing with Lord Ashford, and the gossips stored away this delicious development for later dissection, while Eleanor remained blissfully unaware that her brief moment of visibility had captured the attention of the most dangerous man in London and set into motion events that would transform her quiet existence into something far more perilous than she could ever have imagined. The dance ended too soon, and yet not soon enough, leaving Eleanor breathless and flushed as Lord Thomas guided her back toward the edge of the ballroom with a solicitous hand beneath her elbow, his golden head bent toward hers as he spoke words of admiration that she could scarcely process through the rushing of blood in her ears, for she had not expected this attention, had not prepared herself for the curious stares and whispered speculations that followed their progress across the polished floor like ripples spreading outward from a stone cast into still water. Lord Thomas was saying something about her grace, about how he had watched her earlier in the evening, and found himself quite captivated, and Eleanor murmured appropriate responses, while her mind struggled to reconcile the impossibility of a viscount showing genuine interest in a penniless widow who earned her bread as a companion to elderly ladies. He offered to fetch her champagne, and she accepted more to gain a moment alone than from any real thirst, watching his blue-coated figure disappear into the crowd while she pressed her gloved hands to her burning cheeks and tried to compose herself into something resembling her usual calm dignity. It was then that she felt it again, that peculiar prickling awareness along her spine that made her turn her head almost against her will toward the terrace doors, and there stood the Duke of Thornbury, with his dark gaze fixed upon her with an expression she could not begin to decipher, something between fascination and fury that made her breath catch in her throat. He took a single step forward as though drawn by some invisible force, and Eleanor's heart lurched with mingled terror and anticipation. But then he seemed to catch himself, his jaw tightening with visible effort as he turned abruptly and disappeared through the terrace doors into the cool darkness beyond, leaving her staring after him with questions she dared not examine too closely. Lady Harriet appeared at her side with a rustle of lavender silk and a knowing look in her faded blue eyes, commenting that Eleanor had certainly made an impression this evening, first Lord Ashford and now the Duke himself unable to look away from her, and Eleanor protested that she had done nothing to invite such attention, that she wished only to fulfill her duties and remain invisible as befitted her station. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they rang hollow, knew that some treacherous part of her soul had thrilled at the intensity in Alexander Ravenscroft's eyes, at being seen so completely by a man the world called dangerous. Mrs. Frances Langley had moved closer, her sharp gaze fixed upon Eleanor with the predatory interest of one who sensed scandal brewing, and Eleanor understood with sinking certainty that whatever had transpired this evening would not remain private for long, that by morning the gossips would be feasting upon the curious tale of the grey-clad companion who had somehow captured the notice of both a charming viscount and the most notorious duke in England, and she could not decide whether to feel elated or terrified by the prospect of what tomorrow might bring. The press of bodies and the heat of 1,000 candles had become unbearable, and Eleanor found herself slipping away from Lady Harriet's side with a murmured excuse about needing air, her feet carrying her toward the terrace doors before her mind could counsel against the foolishness of seeking solitude in the very place where she had last seen the Duke of Thornbury disappear into the darkness. The cool April breeze struck her flushed cheeks like a benediction as she stepped through the doors and onto the stone terrace, the scent of roses in early bloom drifting up from the gardens below where moonlight painted silver paths between the hedgerows, and for a moment she simply stood with her eyes closed, breathing deeply and trying to quiet the tumult that Lord Thomas's unexpected attention and the Duke's unsettling stare had awakened within her carefully ordered heart. She should return inside, she knew, should resume her position at Lady Harriet's elbow and remember her place in the world. but the muffled strains of the orchestra and the distant murmur of conversation seemed to belong to another life entirely, one in which she had never danced or been seen or felt the weight of dark eyes following her across a crowded room. It was only when she opened her eyes that she realized she was not alone on the terrace, that the shadows near the balustrade concealed a tall figure whose stillness had allowed him to go unnoticed until this moment, and her breath caught in her throat as Alexander Ravenscroft stepped forward into the moonlight with an expression that made her want to flee and remain in equal measure. "You sought escape as well," he observed, his voice deeper than she had imagined it would be, carrying none of the bored drawl affected by most gentlemen of his station, but rather a directness that felt almost startling in its lack of social artifice. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she considered and discarded several appropriate responses, finally settling on honesty, because something in his gaze suggested he would see through any attempt at polite deflection. "The ballroom grew overwhelming," she admitted, "and I found myself in need of a moment to collect my thoughts, though I did not mean to intrude upon your solitude, Your Grace." The title felt strange on her tongue, too formal for the intimacy of moonlight and roses, yet she clung to it as a reminder of the vast distance between a duke and a companion. He moved closer, not threateningly, but with a purpose that made her acutely aware of how isolated they were, how the music and laughter inside seemed to belong to a world that had temporarily forgotten them both. "You intrude upon nothing," he replied, and something in his tone suggested he meant far more than the terrace. "I have been watching you this evening, Mrs. Sinclair, and I find myself curious about a woman who dances as though she once belonged among the finest ladies, yet stands in the shadows as though she wishes to disappear entirely." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool breeze, wondering how he had learned her name, wondering what else he might have discovered, and wondering most of all why the intensity in his dark eyes made her feel not frightened, but seen in a way she had not experienced since before her world had crumbled into debt and duty and the quiet grey existence of a woman whom society had decided no longer mattered. "You presume to know a great deal about me, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, and she was grateful that her voice emerged steadier than her trembling hands would suggest, for something in his proximity made her acutely aware of every breath she drew, every flutter of her pulse against the delicate skin of her throat, where her mother's pearl earrings caught the moonlight. Alexander's dark eyes, nearly black in the shadows yet glinting with reflected silver from the moon above, studied her with an intensity that should have felt invasive, but instead made her feel as though she were being truly examined for the first time in years, not as a widow or a companion or a woman past her prime, but as something far more interesting than any of those diminishing labels could contain. "I know only what I have observed," he said, stepping closer until she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something darker beneath, something that spoke of brandy and sleepless nights and a restlessness that echoed her own. "I know that you move through that ballroom as though you expect no one to see you, yet when you dance you forget yourself entirely and become something altogether remarkable, and I find myself wondering which version is the truth, and which is the armor you have constructed against a world that has given you little reason for kindness." Eleanor's breath caught at his perception, at the way he had stripped away her careful pretenses with a few words spoken in that low, compelling voice that seemed designed to bypass all her defenses and speak directly to the lonely corners of her heart. "I am Mrs. Sinclair," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite the way it made her feel exposed and vulnerable in the silvered darkness. "I am companion to Lady Harriet Pembroke, nothing more than a servant dressed well enough not to embarrass my employer in polite company, and if you are seeking some mystery to solve, Your Grace, I fear you will find me disappointingly ordinary upon closer examination." She expected him to step back then, expected the invisible wall of social hierarchy to descend between them, as it always did when people learned of her reduced circumstances. But Alexander merely tilted his head slightly, a gesture almost wolfish in its predatory curiosity, and something shifted in his expression that she could not name. "You speak of yourself as though you were nothing," he said quietly. "Yet I have watched you all evening, and I have seen more life and intelligence in your eyes than in any diamond of the first water preening before their mirrors in that ballroom. And I do not care whether you are a companion or a countess, because neither title tells me anything worth knowing about who you truly are beneath the grey silk and the careful composure." Before Eleanor could form a response to words that struck her heart like stones cast into still water, a voice called her name from the terrace doorway, and she turned to see Lord Thomas Ashford, silhouetted against the golden light spilling from within, his handsome face creased with concern as he spotted her standing in the moonlit shadows with the most dangerous man in England, and when she glanced back at Alexander, she saw his jaw tighten with something that looked remarkably like fury, barely leashed beneath the mask of aristocratic indifference. "Miss Sinclair," Lord Thomas said, stepping fully onto the terrace with a smile that seemed too bright against the moonlit shadows, "I have been searching for you everywhere, for they are announcing supper, and I had hoped you might allow me the honor of escorting you," and his words hung in the cool air between the three of them like a challenge issued without his even knowing he had thrown down a gauntlet before the most dangerous man in London. Eleanor felt the tension radiating from Alexander like heat from a banked fire, felt the way his stillness had transformed from contemplative solitude into something far more predatory, and she knew with sudden clarity that she stood at the center of a moment that could define the remainder of her time in society, however brief or unremarkable that time might be. "How kind of you, Lord Thomas," she heard herself say, and her voice sounded distant to her own ears, as though someone else were speaking the polite words while she remained trapped in the magnetic pull of Alexander's dark gaze. She moved toward Thomas with steps that felt heavier than they should, each one carrying her away from something she could not name, but felt keenly as a loss. And when she placed her gloved hand upon Thomas's offered arm, she could have sworn she heard Alexander's breath catch behind her, though perhaps that was merely the wind stirring the roses along the balustrade. The supper-room blazed with the light of crystal chandeliers reflected in polished silver and fine porcelain, white linens stretching across tables laden with delicacies that Eleanor could not imagine tasting while her thoughts remained scattered across the terrace she had just departed, and she allowed Thomas to guide her through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to navigating society's treacherous waters. Lady Harriet caught her eye from across the room, and Eleanor saw the worry creasing her employer's kind face, saw the way the older woman's gaze flickered from Eleanor to somewhere behind her, and then back again with an expression that spoke of alarm barely concealed beneath social composure. Eleanor did not need to turn to know that Alexander had followed them inside, did not need to look to feel the weight of his attention pressing against her back like a physical touch. And when Thomas seated her at a table blessedly distant from wherever the Duke had positioned himself, she found that distance provided no relief from the awareness that hummed beneath her skin. The whispers began almost immediately, carried on currents of curiosity and scandal from one silk-clad shoulder to another, and Eleanor heard fragments that made her cheeks burn with something between embarrassment and a strange, inappropriate pride. The Duke was speaking with her, one voice murmured, with the companion of all people, and can you imagine what Lady Harriet must be thinking? And I heard he refused to let Lord Thomas interrupt them. And did you see his face when she walked away? And Eleanor wished desperately that she could disappear into the white linen tablecloth, rather than endure another moment of being seen in a way she had spent years learning to avoid. Thomas was speaking to her, something about the excellence of the ham and the quality of the champagne, but Eleanor could not focus on his words because she had made the mistake of glancing up, and there across the glittering expanse of the supper-room stood Alexander Ravenscroft, refusing a plate offered by a footman, refusing a seat at any of the tables where society's finest beckoned him to join them, refusing everything except the opportunity to watch her with eyes that promised he had no intention of forgetting their interrupted conversation or allowing another man to claim what he had already decided would be his. The grey light of morning filtered through the modest curtains of Eleanor's small chamber on the third floor of Lady Harriet's townhouse, casting pale shadows across the narrow bed where she had lain awake for most of the night, her thoughts circling endlessly around dark eyes and moonlit terraces, and words spoken with an intensity that had stripped away every defense she had spent years constructing against hope and longing and the dangerous temptation of being truly seen. The rain had begun some time before dawn, a steady drumming against the window panes that matched the restless rhythm of her heart, and Eleanor had finally abandoned any pretense of sleep to sit before her small looking-glass, studying the face that stared back at her with something between resignation and bewilderment. For she could not reconcile the woman she knew herself to be with the woman the Duke of Thornbury had described on that terrace, the woman he had called remarkable and worthy of notice and interesting beyond any title or station. She told herself firmly, as she had told herself a dozen times throughout the sleepless hours, that it meant nothing, that men like Alexander Ravenscroft amused themselves with women like her precisely because such flirtations carried no consequence, no expectation, no risk to their carefully guarded hearts, and she would be the worst sort of fool to imagine otherwise. Her grey gown hung pressed and ready for whatever engagements Lady Harriet might require of her, a silent reminder of her place in the world, and Eleanor found strange comfort in its familiar fabric, its modest cut, its declaration that she expected nothing and therefore could not be disappointed. A knock at her door preceded the entrance of a housemaid carrying a bouquet of pink roses so perfect they seemed almost artificial in their beauty, their sweet fragrance filling the small room as the girl announced with barely concealed excitement that Lord Thomas Ashford had sent them with his card and his compliments and his hopes that Mrs. Sinclair had enjoyed their dance the previous evening. Eleanor read the card twice, noting the elegant handwriting and the proper sentiments expressed within, and she felt something like relief wash through her because here was something she understood, something that followed the rules of the world she inhabited, a kind gentleman offering respectable attention to a widow who should be grateful for any notice at all. When she descended to join Lady Harriet for their morning chocolate, she found her employer already examining the roses with an expression that mingled pleasure with concern, and the older woman's first words were a gentle warning that Eleanor must be careful, that Lord Thomas was charming, but his family would never approve a match with a penniless companion, and that, as for the other gentleman whose attention had been so marked the previous evening, Lady Harriet paused significantly before continuing that the Duke of Thornbury was not a man any sensible woman should encourage, for the whispers about his possessive nature and his ruined rivals were not merely gossip, but documented fact, and Eleanor deserved a quiet life of contentment rather than the dangerous obsession such a man might offer. The afternoon sun broke through the morning's clouds as Lady Harriet's burgundy carriage rolled along the fashionable paths of Hyde Park, joining the procession of society's finest, who gathered each day at this hour to see and be seen in the gentle spring air that carried the scent of new blossoms and the promise of warmer days to come. Eleanor sat beside her employer with her hands folded carefully in her lap, her grey pelisse buttoned against the lingering chill, and she told herself firmly that she was not searching the riders and carriages around them for any particular figure, that her eyes scanned the crowds merely out of habit rather than desperate hope or fearful anticipation. Lady Harriet was discussing the upcoming musicale at Lady Crawford's home, noting with some concern that Georgiana Crawford had never been particularly kind to those she considered beneath her notice, and Eleanor murmured appropriate responses while her treacherous heart continued its survey of every gentleman on horseback who passed within her view. She saw him before she was prepared, the black stallion unmistakable among the chestnuts and bays favoured by other riders, and Alexander Ravenscroft sat upon the magnificent creature with the easy command of a man born to mastery over powerful things, his dark coat impeccable, his bearing regal, despite the casual nature of the afternoon excursion. Their eyes met across the distance of the carriage path, and Eleanor felt the impact of that gaze like a physical blow, felt the breath leave her lungs and the colour rise to her cheeks as he turned his mount with subtle pressure and began to close the distance between them. Lady Harriet fell silent beside her, and Eleanor could sense her employer's sudden tension, could feel the warning in the older woman's stillness as the Duke of Thornbury brought his horse alongside their carriage with a grace that transformed the simple action into something almost predatory. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, and his voice carried that same intensity she remembered from the terrace, that focus that made her feel as though no one else existed in the entire park. "And Lady Harriet, I trust you are enjoying this fine afternoon." Lady Harriet responded with careful politeness, her words correct but cool, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away from Alexander's face, from the way the sunlight revealed depths in his dark eyes that the candlelight had concealed, from the faint curve at the corner of his mouth that suggested he knew exactly the effect he was having upon her composure. The encounter lasted only moments, a brief exchange of pleasantries that any observer might consider unremarkable, but Eleanor knew that Mrs. Francis Langley's carriage had passed them not 3 minutes prior, knew that the gossip's sharp eyes missed nothing, and when Alexander finally inclined his head in farewell and urged his stallion forward, she understood with sinking certainty that by evening every drawing-room in London would be buzzing with speculation about the Duke's continued interest in Lady Harriet's companion, the widow whose invisibility had protected her until a single dance and a moonlit conversation had stripped away every shield she had ever built. The gilded music-room of Lady Crawford's townhouse glittered with candlelight, reflected in 1,000 crystal drops from the chandeliers overhead, and Eleanor felt the weight of hostile attention pressing upon her from the moment she crossed the threshold at Lady Harriet's side, for the whispers that had begun in Hyde Park had clearly reached their hostess's ears and transformed what should have been a pleasant evening of musical entertainment into something far more treacherous. Lady Georgiana Crawford stood at the centre of her domain, in a gown of deep emerald silk that matched her cold eyes, and those eyes found Eleanor immediately, cataloguing her modest grey dress with visible disdain before dismissing her as beneath notice, even while clearly noting her presence as a threat worthy of destruction. Eleanor had hoped to remain invisible, as she had always done at such gatherings, to sit quietly beside Lady Harriet and enjoy the music without drawing further attention to herself. But fate and Lady Harriet's kind intentions conspired against her when her employer mentioned to their hostess that Eleanor played the pianoforte with considerable skill, and Georgiana's smile turned sharp as a blade as she insisted that Mrs. Sinclair simply must perform for the assembled guests. The trap was obvious, the intention to humiliate clear in every line of Georgiana's beautiful face, and Eleanor could not refuse without appearing churlish or cowardly. So she inclined her head in acceptance, while her heart hammered against her ribs with a fear that had nothing to do with performance anxiety, and everything to do with the tall figure she had just glimpsed entering the music-room. Alexander Ravenscroft moved through the crowd like a dark current through still water, and Eleanor watched as guests parted before him with nervous deference, as Georgiana's expression flickered with something raw and wounded before hardening into studied indifference, as the Duke's progress through the room brought him inexorably closer to where Eleanor sat, with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He positioned himself against the wall nearest the pianoforte, close enough that she would feel his presence throughout her performance. And when their eyes met across the gilded room, Eleanor saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch in her throat, a hunger that went beyond mere interest, a focus so complete that she might have been the only person present. Sir Philip Montague appeared at her elbow then, a baron of middling fortune and considerable ambition, whose smile never quite reached his calculating eyes, and he seated himself far too close to Eleanor on the small settee, his thigh nearly brushing hers, as he leaned in to comment on the evening's programme with an intimacy that presumed acquaintance they did not possess. She saw Alexander's expression darken at this new intrusion, saw his jaw tighten and his hands curl into fists at his sides, and Eleanor understood with sudden crystalline clarity that she had become the centre of a dangerous game played by men whose intentions ranged from predatory to possessive, and that her own heart, treacherous organ that it was, had already begun to choose sides despite every warning her rational mind could offer against the dark intensity of a duke who looked at her as though he would burn the world to keep her close. The final notes of the sonata faded into silence, and Eleanor lifted her trembling fingers from the ivory keys, her heart pounding with an intensity that had nothing to do with the modest applause that scattered through Lady Crawford's music room like reluctant rain upon a window pane, for she had played not for the assembled guests who barely noticed her existence, but for one pair of dark eyes that had watched her hands move across the pianoforte with an attention so complete that she had felt each note resonate through her body as though he were touching her, rather than merely observing from his position against the gilded wall. She rose from the instrument on unsteady legs, prepared to retreat to Lady Harriet's side and reclaim the invisibility that had always been her armour. But Alexander Ravenscroft moved through the crowd before she could escape, his tall figure parting the other guests like a ship cutting through still water. And when he reached her side, he stood close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and something darker, something that made her think of midnight and danger and desires she had long ago learned to suppress. "You play as though the music is a secret you are sharing," he said, his voice pitched low so that only she could hear, intimate despite the dozens of people who surrounded them and watched with barely concealed fascination. "And there is grief in your Beethoven, Mrs. Sinclair, but also defiance, and I find myself wondering what sorrows have taught your fingers to speak so eloquently when your lips remain so carefully guarded." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at this observation that cut far too close to truths she kept buried, at the way he saw through the performance to the performer beneath, and she opened her mouth to deliver some dismissive reply that would restore the safe distance between them, when Sir Philip Montague appeared at her other elbow with the persistence of a man who sensed an opportunity and intended to seize it regardless of whatever obstacles stood in his path. "Mrs. Sinclair, you must allow me to turn pages for you if you play again this evening," Philip said with a smile that revealed too many teeth and eyes that travelled over her figure with an assessment that made her skin crawl, for a woman of your obvious talents deserves an appreciative audience, and I consider myself quite the connoisseur of musical excellence. The change in Alexander was subtle, but unmistakable to Eleanor, who had become attuned to his moods despite knowing him for mere days, a stillness that descended over his features like frost forming on glass, a hardening of his jaw, and a coldness that entered his dark eyes as they fixed upon Philip with an intensity that spoke of violence barely leashed by the thin constraints of civilized society. "I believe Mrs. Sinclair has exerted herself sufficiently for one evening," Alexander said, and though his tone remained perfectly polite, Eleanor heard the warning beneath the words, felt the claim implicit in his positioning of his body between her and Philip, and she watched Georgiana Crawford's beautiful face contort with fury from across the room as she witnessed her former betrothed defend a mere companion with the same possessive energy he had never shown for her. The morning of April 7th dawned bright with spring sunshine that streamed through the windows of Lady Harriet's drawing-room, casting warm, golden light across the yellow silk walls and illuminating the delicate porcelain of the tea service that sat upon the mahogany table between the two women who occupied the cheerful space, Eleanor with her needlework lying forgotten in her lap, and Lady Harriet with her correspondence spread before her, both engaged in the quiet domestic rituals that had defined Eleanor's existence for the past 2 years, until a knock at the door shattered the comfortable silence, and the butler announced a visitor whose name made Eleanor's heart stutter and Lady Harriet's teacup freeze halfway to her lips. The Duke of Thornbury strode into the drawing-room, wearing riding clothes that suggested an impulsive visit rather than a planned social call, his dark hair slightly windswept, and his presence filling the modest space with an intensity that seemed to dim the very sunlight, and Eleanor felt the blood rush to her cheeks as she rose to curtsy alongside her employer, while her mind raced to understand what possible reason could have brought him here, to this house, at this hour, when no connection existed between Lady Harriet and the Duke that would justify such a breach of protocol. Lady Harriet recovered her composure with the practiced grace of a woman who had navigated society for 6 decades, offering the Duke tea and a seat with all the proper courtesies, while her eyes darted to Eleanor with an expression of barely concealed alarm, for she understood what this visit signified, even if Eleanor still struggled to accept the evidence of her own senses. Alexander accepted the tea but ignored the refreshments, his dark gaze finding Eleanor's face with the same unwavering focus she had felt at the musicale, at the park, at the ball where everything had begun. And when he spoke it was ostensibly to Lady Harriet about the weather and the season's entertainments, yet his attention never wavered from Eleanor, his questions somehow always circling back to her opinions, her observations, her quiet comments that he seized upon with an intellectual hunger that matched her own. She found herself drawn into debate about a volume of poetry she had mentioned reading, her earlier reserve melting as she discovered that his mind was as sharp as his reputation suggested, that beneath the cold exterior lay a man who had read widely and thought deeply, and who listened to her arguments with genuine interest rather than the condescending tolerance she had learned to expect from gentlemen of his station. Lady Harriet watched this exchange with growing concern written plainly across her kind features, her teacup growing cold in her hands as she witnessed the connection sparking between her companion and the most dangerous man in London. And when the Duke finally rose to take his leave after an hour that had passed like minutes, he bowed over Eleanor's hand with a pressure that lingered far longer than propriety allowed, and Lady Harriet saw in her companion's flushed cheeks and bright eyes the beginning of something that would either save Eleanor from her lonely existence or destroy her entirely. The afternoon sun of April 8th cast long golden shadows across the gravel paths of Hyde Park as Eleanor walked beside Lord Thomas Ashford during the fashionable promenade hour, her gloved hand resting lightly upon his offered arm, while all around them the cream of London society paraded in their finest carriages and walking attire, and she tried desperately to focus upon the pleasant conversation Thomas maintained, rather than scanning the crowded paths for a tall figure with dark eyes who had occupied her thoughts since his unexpected morning call the day before, for Thomas represented everything sensible and safe that a woman in her position should desire, a respectable viscount with a comfortable fortune and genuine kindness in his manner, a man who looked at her with warmth rather than the consuming intensity that made her feel as though she were standing too close to a flame. The blue ribbons of her new bonnet fluttered in the spring breeze, a gift Thomas had sent that morning, along with a note expressing his hope that she would wear them when they walked together, and Eleanor had tied them beneath her chin with fingers that trembled slightly at the implications of accepting such a personal token, knowing that every eye in the park would note this visible sign of his courtship and draw their own conclusions about her future. "Mrs. Sinclair," Thomas said, his voice carrying the earnest quality that had first drawn her attention at the opening ball. "I hope you will forgive my directness, but I find that I cannot continue in this state of uncertainty, for you must know that my feelings for you have grown beyond mere admiration, and I wish to ask your permission to court you formally, to make my intentions known to society and to Lady Harriet, so that there can be no doubt about the honourable nature of my regard." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat at this declaration she had both anticipated and dreaded, for Thomas offered her everything practical that she had learned to value during the years of her widowhood, security and respectability and freedom from the precarious existence of a paid companion. Yet even as she opened her mouth to accept his suit with the gratitude a woman of her circumstances ought to feel, the sound of carriage wheels upon gravel drew her attention to the path beside them, and she turned to see Alexander Ravenscroft's black carriage with its distinctive crest passing slowly enough that she could clearly observe the Duke seated within, his dark gaze fixed upon the tableau she and Thomas presented, with an expression that made her blood run cold even as it set her pulse racing with something far more dangerous than fear. The carriage passed without stopping, without any acknowledgement beyond that single searing look, yet Eleanor felt as though Alexander had spoken directly into her ear, had laid claim to her before the entire assembled company, and when she turned back to Thomas with her answer trembling upon her lips, she found that the words of acceptance had died unspoken, replaced by a hesitation she could not fully explain, and a request for more time to consider that made Thomas's hopeful expression falter even as he graciously agreed to wait for her decision. The evening of April 9th brought Eleanor to Lord Benjamin Harcourt's townhouse for a card party she had desperately wished to avoid. Yet Lady Harriet had accepted the invitation before the events of the previous afternoon, and now Eleanor found herself seated in a corner of the elegant drawing-room, while the gentlemen retreated to the card-room beyond, the air thick with cigar smoke that drifted through the connecting doors, and the sounds of masculine laughter and clinking glasses that spoke of a world from which women were excluded, yet upon which their fates so often depended. She had seen Alexander arrive an hour earlier, his dark figure commanding attention even as he moved through the crowded rooms with the predatory grace she had come to recognize, and she had watched him disappear into the card-room with Lord Harcourt at his side, the two men clearly intimate friends despite the contrast between Benjamin's open, genial countenance and Alexander's brooding intensity. In the card-room itself, illuminated by the golden glow of branched candelabras and hazy with smoke from expensive cigars, Alexander stood at a table where Thomas Ashford held court among a group of young gentlemen, his blue coat with its gold buttons catching the light as he laughed at some jest, entirely unaware of the danger that approached until the Duke's shadow fell across the green baize. Benjamin Harcourt watched his oldest friend move through the room with growing unease, for he had known Alexander since their days at Eton, had witnessed the transformation wrought by Georgiana's betrayal, and had hoped that time might soften the hard edges that now defined the Duke's character. Yet the look in Alexander's eyes as he approached the Viscount spoke not of healing, but of something far more troubling. "Lord Ashford," Alexander said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach Thomas's ears without alerting the broader company. "I understand you have been paying particular attention to a certain lady of my acquaintance, and I feel compelled to advise you that such attentions would be most unwisely continued." Thomas looked up with the confident smile of a man who had never truly faced consequence, his handsome features arranged in an expression of polite bemusement, as he replied that he could not imagine what the Duke meant, for Mrs. Sinclair was a free woman, and he a gentleman with honourable intentions. Alexander leaned closer, his next words pitched for Thomas alone, and though Benjamin could not hear what was said, he saw Thomas's confident smile falter for just a moment before reasserting itself with forced bravado, saw the younger man laugh and wave his hand dismissively as though the Duke of Thornbury were merely an amusing eccentric rather than a man who had destroyed 3 gentlemen's reputations without breaking a sweat. In the drawing-room, Eleanor felt a sudden chill despite the warmth of the fire, a premonition of something terrible taking shape in the smoky room beyond, and when Alexander emerged some time later and his dark gaze found hers across the crowded space, she saw in his expression a promise that made her blood run cold even as her treacherous heart beat faster at the intensity of his regard. The morning of April 12th dawned grey and unforgiving, rain streaking the windows of Lady Harriet's townhouse like tears upon glass as Eleanor sat in the breakfast-room with her needlework lying untouched in her lap, her thoughts still churning from the strange atmosphere of the card party 3 nights prior, and the way Alexander had looked at her when he emerged from that smoky room as though he had set something irrevocable in motion and wanted her to know it without understanding what it meant. And she was still lost in these troubled reflections when Lady Harriet entered with the morning scandal sheets clutched in her trembling hands, and an expression of such profound dismay that Eleanor rose immediately from her chair, her heart already constricting with dread before a single word had been spoken. "My dear child," Lady Harriet said, her voice wavering as she lowered herself into the nearest chair with none of her usual grace. "I hardly know how to tell you this, but Lord Ashford has been utterly ruined, and the papers are full of nothing else this morning, for it seems his family has been concealing the most dreadful secrets, gambling debts stretching back generations, and an illegitimate sibling whose existence threatens the very legitimacy of his claim to the viscountcy, and society has turned upon him with the savage delight that only the ton can muster when one of their own falls from grace." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as Lady Harriet read aloud the most damning passages, each revelation more devastating than the last, painting a portrait of a family built upon lies and financial ruin that made Thomas's honourable courtship of a penniless widow seem not like kindness but like desperate necessity, and though Eleanor knew she should feel sympathy for the man who had treated her with such genuine warmth, all she could think of was Alexander's dark gaze across Lord Harcourt's drawing-room, and the quiet certainty in his bearing that spoke of plans already set in motion. The rain intensified against the windows as a messenger arrived with a note bearing Thomas's seal, the paper spotted with what might have been raindrops or tears as Eleanor read his desperate words, begging her to believe that his intentions toward her had always been pure, that the scandal sheets told truth, but not the whole truth, and that he had hoped to rebuild his family's honor through an advantageous match rather than deceive her. And she felt something cold settle in her chest as she recognized the pattern that had emerged, the surgical precision with which Thomas had been dismantled the moment he had dared to formally court her, and she knew with terrible certainty that Alexander Ravenscroft had kept whatever dark promise he had whispered in that card-room, had demonstrated exactly what he was capable of when another man presumed to claim what he considered his own. She looked up from Thomas's letter to meet Lady Harriet's worried gaze, and in that moment Eleanor understood that she stood at the edge of something far more dangerous than a simple courtship, that the Duke of Thornbury played by rules that society could neither comprehend nor contain, and that she would need to confront him directly if she wished to understand what manner of monster had fixed his obsessive attention upon her unremarkable person. The afternoon had barely reached 3 o'clock when Eleanor heard the front door open and the unmistakable sound of heavy boots upon the marble foyer, and she knew before the butler could announce him that Alexander Ravenscroft had come, as though summoned by the fury that had been building in her chest since reading Thomas's desperate letter, and she rose from her chair in the drawing-room with its yellow silk walls that now seemed to mock her with their cheerful brightness, her hands clenched at her sides as he appeared in the doorway, filling it with his dark presence, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch despite her rage. Lady Harriet had departed for afternoon calls not 20 minutes prior, leaving Eleanor alone in a way that would have been scandalous under any circumstances, but now felt dangerous, charged with an electricity that crackled between them as Alexander stepped into the room without waiting for invitation, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly airless space. "You destroyed him?" Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she had expected, her chin lifted in defiance even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "You uncovered every secret his family possessed and fed them to the scandal sheets like meat to hungry dogs. And for what? Because he dared to court a woman you spoke to twice on a terrace." Alexander moved closer, his tall frame towering over her as he had that first night at Hartwick House. But now there was no moonlight to soften his features, only the grey afternoon light that revealed every hard angle of his face as he replied without a trace of remorse that Thomas Ashford had been warned and had chosen to ignore that warning, that the consequences were entirely of his own making. Eleanor felt her fury rise like a tide, her voice climbing as she demanded to know what gave him the right to ruin a man's life, to scatter a family's secrets to the winds, to appoint himself judge and executioner of anyone who showed her kindness. And Alexander's response came in a voice so low and certain that it seemed to vibrate through her very bones as he said that, if he could not have her, then he would destroy every man who looked at her, every gentleman who dared to imagine he might claim what belonged to Alexander alone, and he would continue to do so until she understood that her fate was already sealed. "You are a monster," Eleanor whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them, and something flickered in Alexander's dark eyes, something that might have been pain beneath the possessive hunger, as he reached out to catch her chin with gentle fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly against her skin, forcing her to meet his gaze as he replied that she was the only woman in the world who could have made him one, that before her he had been merely cold, and now he was consumed, and Eleanor felt her treacherous heart stutter at the raw confession. Even as her mind screamed warnings about the danger of the man before her, the impossibility of what he offered, and the terrifying realization that some part of her had already begun to burn in answer to his devastating flame. Eleanor stood frozen in the aftermath of his words, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her chest, as Alexander's fingers remained gentle against her chin, and she knew she should pull away, should demand he leave, should summon the servants and have him escorted from the house in disgrace. But instead she found herself searching his dark eyes for some sign that this was merely a game to him, some cruel amusement at the expense of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Yet what she found there was far more terrifying than mockery, because it was truth, raw and unvarnished and burning with an intensity that threatened to consume them both. "You cannot simply claim a person," she finally managed to whisper, her voice emerging smaller than she intended as his thumb traced a path along her jaw that sent tremors through her entire body. "People are not possessions to be hoarded and protected through destruction, and I am not some prize to be won by eliminating the competition like horses in a race." Alexander's laugh was low and without humor as he released her chin only to capture her hand instead, raising it to his lips in a gesture that should have been courtly but felt instead like a brand being pressed to her skin. And his response came measured and certain as he told her that she misunderstood entirely, that he did not view her as a prize, but as the only person in his miserable existence who had looked at him without fear or calculation or greed, the only woman who had challenged him on that moonlit terrace instead of simpering or scheming, and that recognition had awakened something in him that he had believed long dead. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows as Eleanor struggled to reconcile the monster she knew him to be with the wounded creature now standing before her, with her hand pressed to his lips, and she thought of Thomas's desperate letter crumpled on the side table, thought of the life that had been destroyed simply because a kind man had dared to show her attention, and she forced herself to speak the words that needed to be said even as some treacherous part of her heart cracked at their necessity. "Whatever you believe you feel," she said, pulling her hand from his grasp with more reluctance than she wished to acknowledge. "It is not love, but obsession. Not passion, but possession. And I will not be the excuse you use to ruin innocent men. I will not become complicit in your cruelty simply because my foolish heart races when you enter a room." Alexander's expression shifted then, something flickering across his features that might have been pain, or perhaps merely the recognition that she was not the easy conquest he had imagined, and he stepped back with a formality that seemed almost mocking after the intensity of moments before, his voice cooling to the distant tones of a duke addressing a servant as he informed her that she could reject him as many times as she wished, could build walls of righteous fury between them and pretend that what crackled in the air when they stood close meant nothing. But his promise remained unchanged, and his patience was infinite. And eventually she would understand that fighting the inevitable only prolonged the suffering of those foolish enough to stand between them. He was gone before she could form a response, the door closing behind him with terrible finality as Eleanor sank into the nearest chair and pressed her trembling hands to her face. The days that followed Alexander's departure from Lady Harriet's drawing room passed in a haze of sleepless nights and tortured contemplation, as Eleanor found herself replaying every word he had spoken, every touch of his fingers against her skin, every dark promise that had fallen from his lips like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the carefully constructed calm she had maintained since her husband's death left her with nothing but debts and the necessity of earning her keep through service to others. Lady Harriet had returned from her calls to find Eleanor pale and shaken, and though the elderly widow had pressed gently for explanation, Eleanor had offered only vague assurances that the afternoon's solitude had left her melancholy, unwilling to confess that the Duke of Thornbury had stood in this very room and declared his intention to destroy any man who dared look upon her with desire, unwilling to admit that some treacherous part of her soul had thrilled at the possession in his voice, even as her conscience recoiled from the cruelty of his methods. April 14th dawned grey and cheerless, the sky hanging low over London like a shroud, as Eleanor accompanied Lady Harriet to a morning gathering at Mrs. Langley's residence, and she felt the weight of curious stares pressing upon her from the moment they entered the crowded parlour, whispers following in their wake like shadows that refused to be shaken. The scandal surrounding Thomas Ashford had not diminished, but rather grown in the telling, with each repetition adding new embellishments to the tale of hidden debts and family secrets exposed, and Eleanor understood with sickening clarity that her name had become entangled in the gossip, that society had begun to connect her brief courtship with the Viscount to his subsequent ruination. That speculation now swirled about what role the Duke of Thornbury might have played in orchestrating the destruction of a man who had dared to show attention to a mere companion. Mrs. Langley herself approached with barely concealed eagerness, her eyes bright with the particular hunger of one who trades in information and finds herself suddenly possessed of the most valuable currency the tongue could offer, and her questions came wrapped in false sympathy as she inquired after Eleanor's health, after her spirits following dear Lord Ashford's troubles, after whether she had received any interesting callers in recent days. Eleanor answered with the composure that years of service had taught her, revealing nothing while saying enough to satisfy the most basic requirements of politeness. But she could feel the other women watching, measuring, calculating the worth of this grey-clad widow who had somehow captured the attention of London's most dangerous duke and brought ruin upon the head of a perfectly respectable viscount in the span of a single fortnight. Lady Harriet's hand found Eleanor's beneath the cover of her shawl, squeezing gently in silent support, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes at this small kindness from a woman who had every reason to dismiss her, to distance herself from the scandal that now clung to Eleanor's name like perfume that could not be washed away, yet who instead drew closer, offering the protection of her presence and her reputation as a shield against the vultures who circled with increasing boldness. The morning stretched interminably, each minute weighted with unspoken accusations and speculative glances, until finally Lady Harriet declared her rheumatism troublesome and requested their carriage be brought round, and Eleanor had never been more grateful for the convenient fiction of an elderly woman's aching joints as they made their escape from the suffocating atmosphere of curiosity and judgment that Mrs. Langley's parlour had become. The carriage ride back to Lady Harriet's townhouse passed in silence, the wheels rattling over cobblestones while Eleanor stared unseeing through rain-streaked windows at a London that had become suddenly hostile, a city of whispers and pointed glances where she had once moved invisible and therefore safe. And she understood now with terrible clarity that Alexander's attention had stripped away the protection of her insignificance and left her exposed to the full scrutiny of a society that delighted in nothing so much as the destruction of those who dared to rise above their station. Lady Harriet spoke first as they entered the sanctuary of her drawing-room, her voice gentle but firm as she guided Eleanor to the settee by the fire and took her hands in her own weathered grip, and her words came with the weight of experience as she told Eleanor that she had lived long enough to recognize obsession when she saw it, that the Duke of Thornbury watched Eleanor with the intensity of a man who had found something precious after years of believing himself incapable of valuing anything at all, and that such intensity could be either salvation or destruction, depending on how it was handled. Eleanor felt the tears she had suppressed all morning finally break free as she confessed everything to her employer, the terrace conversation that had sparked something dangerous between them, the morning call where Alexander had barely bothered to conceal his interest, the afternoon confrontation where he had spoken words that still burned in her memory like brands pressed to tender flesh, and most damning of all, the traitorous response of her own heart that quickened at his approach, even as her mind screamed warnings about the wreckage he left in his wake. Lady Harriet listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation, until finally she rose and moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the grey afternoon light, as she spoke of her own youth, of a time when she too had been caught between the safety of the expected path and the terrifying allure of a man who offered something far more dangerous than security. And her voice cracked slightly as she admitted that she had chosen safety, had married her comfortable Lord Pembroke, and lived a life of pleasant predictability, and that she had never quite forgiven herself for the cowardice that had let passion slip through her fingers in favor of propriety. The confession startled Eleanor from her own spiraling thoughts, and she looked at her employer with new eyes as Lady Harriet continued, saying that she was not advising Eleanor to surrender to the Duke's possessive pursuit, that his methods were cruel and his obsession frightening in its intensity, but that she was also not certain that the answer lay in running from the only man who had ever looked at Eleanor and seen not a widow past her prime or a companion to be overlooked, but a woman worthy of destruction and devotion in equal measure. The rain continued to fall as the two women sat together in the gathering darkness, neither speaking of the future that loomed uncertain before them, and somewhere across London, Alexander Ravenscroft stood at the window of his study, thinking of grey eyes and trembling hands, and the woman who had called him a monster without flinching from his gaze. The following evening brought yet another obligation that Eleanor could not escape, for Lady Harriet had accepted an invitation to the Countess of Westbrook's soirée weeks before the season began, and to withdraw now would only fuel the flames of speculation that already threatened to consume Eleanor's fragile position in society, and so she found herself once again donning her grey gown and her mother's pearl earrings, armour against a world that had suddenly noticed her existence and found in that noticing endless opportunity for judgment and cruel amusement. The Westbrook residence blazed with candlelight as their carriage joined the queue of vehicles depositing London's elite at the grand entrance, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with dread as she contemplated the evening ahead, knowing that Alexander would likely be present, knowing that Sir Philip Montague had sent her a note expressing his intention to seek her company, knowing that Georgiana Crawford would be watching for any opportunity to strike at the woman who had somehow captured the attention her former betrothed had never deigned to bestow upon her, even during their engagement. Lady Harriet squeezed her hand as they ascended the marble steps, murmuring that Eleanor need only say the word, and they would plead illness and retreat. But Eleanor squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, refusing to give the gossips the satisfaction of seeing her cower, refusing to let Alexander Ravenscroft's dark obsession or society's whispered condemnation drive her from the field like a defeated soldier fleeing before superior forces. The ballroom swallowed them into its glittering maw, and Eleanor felt the weight of countless gazes pressing upon her as she guided Lady Harriet toward a cluster of chairs along the wall where the elderly widow might rest her troublesome joints while maintaining a clear view of the proceedings, and she had barely settled her employer before she sensed him, before the air itself seemed to change and thicken with his presence somewhere behind her, watching as he always watched now, with that intensity that made her feel simultaneously hunted and treasured. She did not turn, did not give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement, but her traitorous heart began its familiar racing as she heard his footsteps approaching, measured and deliberate. And then his voice came low beside her ear as he asked whether she intended to ignore him all evening, or whether she might spare him a single glance, and the warmth of his breath against her neck sent shivers cascading down her spine, despite every warning her rational mind screamed about the danger of this man and the destruction he had already wrought upon those who dared to stand between them. Eleanor finally turned to face him, and the sight of Alexander in his perfectly tailored black evening clothes, his dark hair swept back from that aristocratic face that society's mothers warned their daughters about in hushed tones, nearly stole the breath from her lungs as she met his gaze, and saw there not the cold predator she expected, but something far more devastating, a hunger that went beyond possession into territory she dared not name, a recognition of her soul that no man had ever offered her before. She told him in a voice barely above a whisper that she did not understand him, that she could not reconcile the man who had destroyed Thomas Ashford's reputation with such cold efficiency with the man who now stood before her, looking at her as though she were the only fixed point in a spinning universe. And Alexander's response came not in words, but in the slight softening of his severe expression as he asked whether he might have the honor of a dance, a request so mundane and yet so weighted with meaning that Eleanor felt the world around them recede into a blur of candlelight and music and the distant murmur of scandalized whispers. She should have refused him, should have cited her position as companion, her duty to Lady Harriet, the impropriety of dancing with a man who had declared his intention to destroy any rival who dared pursue her. But instead she found herself placing her gloved hand in his and allowing him to lead her toward the floor where couples were assembling for a waltz. And the gasps that rippled through the assembled guests told her that she had just committed an act of social rebellion that would echo through drawing rooms for weeks to come. His hand settled at her waist with a possessiveness that should have frightened her, and as they began to move together in the intimate embrace the waltz demanded, Eleanor felt the heat of his palm burning through the layers of fabric that separated his skin from hers, and she understood suddenly why mothers warned their daughters about this dance, why chaperones watched with hawkish vigilance, for there was nothing innocent about the way Alexander held her, nothing proper about the intensity with which his dark eyes bore into hers as they swept across the polished floor. He spoke then in a voice meant only for her, telling her that he knew she thought him a monster for what he had done to Ashford, that she was right to fear his obsession, that he had spent years convincing himself he was incapable of feeling anything beyond cold ambition and colder vengeance, but that she had awakened something in him that terrified him far more than it terrified her, something that made him want to possess her completely, while simultaneously wanting to worship at her feet like a supplicant before a goddess. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she replied that pretty words could not undo the cruelty of his actions, that Thomas Ashford had been a good man whose only crime was showing her kindness, and Alexander's jaw tightened as he admitted that he was not a good man, had never claimed to be, that the darkness in him had been planted there by a woman who had promised him everything, and then laughed as she walked away with another, but that Eleanor made him want to try to be better, even as she made him capable of terrible things in her name. The music swelled around them as they turned and dipped in perfect synchronicity, two souls locked in a battle neither could win, and across the room Georgiana Crawford watched with hatred blazing in her emerald eyes, while Sir Philip Montague calculated how best to use this public display to his own advantage, and Eleanor knew, as the final notes faded, that nothing in her carefully ordered life would ever be the same again. The days that followed the Westbrook soiree passed in a blur of whispered speculation and pointed silences whenever Eleanor entered a room, for society had witnessed the Duke of Thornbury waltz with a mere companion and had not yet decided whether to be scandalized or fascinated by this breach of every convention that governed their glittering world, and Eleanor found herself suspended between dread and a treacherous longing she could not seem to extinguish, no matter how sternly she lectured herself about the danger of allowing her heart to soften toward a man who had already demonstrated his capacity for destruction. Lady Harriet watched her young companion with growing concern, noting the shadows beneath Eleanor's eyes and the way her needlework lay forgotten in her lap as she stared out rain-streaked windows. And finally, on the morning of April 17th, the elderly widow set aside her correspondence and addressed Eleanor directly, saying that she had remained silent long enough, but that she could no longer pretend not to see the storm clouds gathering around them both, for the Duke's attentions had placed Eleanor in an impossible position, where acceptance meant aligning herself with a man feared by all of London, while rejection might provoke consequences too terrible to contemplate given what had befallen poor Lord Ashford. Eleanor felt tears threatening as she admitted that she did not know what to do, that she had spent her entire widowhood cultivating invisibility as armor against a world that had no place for impoverished women of gentle birth, and now that armor had been stripped away by a man whose intensity frightened her, even as it made her feel truly seen for the first time in her 26 years. Lady Harriet crossed the room to take Eleanor's hands in her own papery grasp, her rheumatic fingers surprisingly strong as she held tight, and spoke with the wisdom of a woman who had navigated 7 decades of society's treacherous waters, telling Eleanor that she had watched the Duke during that waltz and had seen something in his face that she had never expected to witness, not possession alone, but something perilously close to reverence, and that while she feared his darkness, she also wondered whether Eleanor might be the only light capable of penetrating it. The sound of the door knocker interrupted their intimate conference, and moments later the butler appeared with a silver salver bearing a card that made Lady Harriet's eyebrows rise nearly to her lace cap, for Sir Philip Montague had come to call, and behind him Eleanor could hear another voice, deeper and edged with barely contained fury, as Alexander Ravenscroft demanded to know what business Montague had at this address. Eleanor rose on trembling legs as the drawing-room doors opened to admit both men, Philip's smile too smooth and Alexander's expression thunderous, and she understood with sudden clarity that she stood at the center of a battle that had nothing to do with her happiness, and everything to do with masculine pride and the terrible possessiveness that drove men to destroy what they could not claim. Yet even as fear gripped her heart, she felt something else stirring beneath it, a fierce determination to be more than a prize fought over by wolves, to claim agency over her own fate regardless of the cost. Sir Philip Montague stepped forward with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to navigating hostile territory, his smile never wavering even as Alexander's presence behind him radiated menace like heat from a forge, and he addressed Lady Harriet with elaborate courtesy, while his pale eyes slid toward Eleanor with an interest that made her skin crawl in ways that Thomas Ashford's honest admiration never had, for there was something calculating in Philip's gaze, something that measured her worth not in terms of affection, but of advantage, and she understood suddenly that this man saw her newfound notoriety as an opportunity to be exploited rather than a woman to be cherished. Alexander moved into the room like a storm-gathering force, his dark coat immaculate, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, every element of his appearance controlled except for his eyes, which burned with a fury that made Lady Harriet shrink back against her chair cushions and caused even the butler to retreat hastily and close the doors behind him, leaving the four of them suspended in a moment of unbearable tension as the fire crackled in the hearth and rain continued its relentless assault against the windows. Philip turned to face his rival with an expression of studied innocence, remarking that he had not expected to find the Duke of Thornbury paying morning calls on companions, that surely a man of his station had more pressing matters to attend to than hovering over a widow of no particular fortune or connection, and the insult embedded in his words was so precisely aimed that Eleanor felt it like a blade between her ribs, even as Alexander's jaw tightened with barely contained violence. The Duke's response came in a voice so cold it seemed to drop the temperature of the yellow silk drawing-room by several degrees, informing Philip that his business at this address was none of his concern, that if he valued his reputation and his health, he would remove himself immediately and permanently from any location where Mrs. Sinclair might be found, and the threat was delivered with such quiet certainty that Eleanor felt her heart stutter in her chest even as something fierce and unwanted blazed to life within her at hearing herself defended with such terrifying intensity. Philip laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and replied that the Duke could not possibly destroy every man who showed interest in the charming widow, that surely even his reach had limits, that perhaps Mrs. Sinclair herself should be permitted to choose her own company rather than having suitors eliminated by a jealous madman who had already demonstrated his willingness to ruin innocent men, and Eleanor watched Alexander's hands curl into fists at his sides as the air between the two men crackled with impending violence. Lady Harriet found her voice at last, rising from her chair with a dignity that belied her trembling hands, declaring that she would not have her home turned into a battlefield, that both gentlemen would leave immediately, that Eleanor was under her protection and would not be subjected to scenes more appropriate to a boxing ring than a drawing-room, and her words hung in the air as Philip sketched an ironic bow and Alexander stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Eleanor with an expression that seemed to ask whether she truly wished him gone, whether she would choose the scheming baron's poisoned courtesy over his own dark and dangerous devotion. Eleanor found herself unable to speak as the two men stood frozen in Lady Harriet's drawing-room, the tension between them thick enough to choke upon, and she watched Philip's smooth smile falter for just a moment as he seemed to register for the first time that the Duke's threats were not the empty posturing of a jealous fool, but the genuine promise of a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to destroy anyone who stood between himself and the object of his obsession. And in that moment of hesitation, Eleanor saw something shift in the Baron's pale eyes, a calculation taking place as he weighed the potential rewards of pursuing her against the very real danger of earning Alexander Ravenscroft's enmity. Lady Harriet's command hung in the air between them all, her aged voice still trembling, but her spine straight with the dignity of a woman who had survived decades of society's cruelties and would not see her home turned into a stage for masculine violence. And slowly Philip executed another of his mocking bows, before turning toward the door with a final lingering glance at Eleanor that promised this encounter was far from finished, his footsteps echoing through the hallway as the front door opened and closed behind him. Alexander did not move, his dark eyes fixed upon Eleanor's face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat, and she could see the war being waged behind his carefully controlled expression, the struggle between his desire to stay and press his suit and the knowledge that Lady Harriet had ordered him to leave, that Eleanor herself had called him a monster mere days ago and had every reason to wish him gone from her presence forever. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the continued assault of rain against the windows, until finally Alexander spoke in a voice so low that Eleanor had to strain to hear him, saying that he would go because Lady Harriet had asked it of him, because he would not repay her kindness to Eleanor by forcing his presence where it was unwanted, but that Eleanor should know he had meant every word he had spoken about protecting her from men like Montague, men who saw her vulnerability and sought to exploit it for their own gain. Eleanor felt something crack within her chest at his words, at the way his voice softened when he spoke of protection rather than possession, and she found herself taking a step toward him before she could stop herself, her hand reaching out as if to touch his sleeve before she caught herself and let it fall back to her side, and she saw his eyes track that aborted movement with an expression that looked almost like hope before he mastered himself and turned toward the door. He paused at the threshold, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, and without turning back he spoke once more, telling Eleanor that he knew she believed him incapable of anything but destruction, that his reputation gave her every reason to fear him, but that she should ask herself why Philip Montague had chosen this particular moment to press his suit, why the Baron had appeared at her door mere days after Thomas Ashford's ruin, and whether she truly believed it coincidence that another predator had emerged the moment the first had been driven away. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly empty drawing room, and Eleanor stood motionless as Lady Harriet sank back into her chair with a heavy sigh, the elderly woman's face pale with the strain of the confrontation, while outside the rain continued to fall, and Eleanor felt the first stirring of doubt about which of her suitors truly posed the greater danger. The days that followed Alexander's departure from Lady Harriet's drawing room passed in a blur of whispered speculation and pointed glances, for society had taken notice of the extraordinary triangle forming around the invisible companion, who had somehow captured the attention of both a dangerous duke and a scheming baron. And Eleanor found herself subjected to a scrutiny she had never before experienced in all her years of quiet service, her grey gowns and modest demeanour suddenly insufficient camouflage against the relentless curiosity of the ton who wondered what possible quality this unremarkable widow possessed that could drive men to such extremes of behaviour. Lady Harriet kept Eleanor close during this period of heightened attention, the elderly woman's rheumatism flaring with the stress of watching her companion become the subject of drawing-room speculation, and together they navigated a careful path through invitations that had once been extended out of obligation, but now carried an undercurrent of voyeuristic anticipation, hostesses eager to witness the next chapter in the drama unfolding around Mrs. Sinclair. Eleanor spent her sleepless nights replaying Alexander's parting words about Philip Montague, turning them over in her mind like stones worn smooth by a river's current, and she found herself examining the Baron's sudden interest with new eyes, remembering how he had appeared at precisely the moment Thomas Ashford's ruin became public knowledge, how his smile had never quite reached those pale, calculating eyes, how his compliments had focused not on her character, but on her newfound notoriety as the woman the Duke of Thornbury had chosen to pursue. The realization crept upon her slowly, like dawn light filtering through heavy curtains, that perhaps Alexander's warning had contained more truth than possessive jealousy, that Philip's attentions might indeed be motivated by something far more sinister than simple attraction, and she recalled whispers she had overheard about the Baron's mounting debts, his reputation for pursuing heiresses who mysteriously broke their engagements after private conversations with his solicitors, his talent for extracting advantage from vulnerable women who had no powerful protectors to shield them from his machinations. She thought too of Alexander himself during those long hours before sleep, finally claimed her, remembering not the cold fury in his eyes when he confronted Philip, but the way his voice had softened when he spoke of protection rather than possession, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands when she had reached toward him and then stopped herself, the look of something like hope that had flickered across his features before he mastered it and turned away. And she wondered whether she had been too quick to condemn him as a monster, when perhaps he was simply a man who had never learned to love without the fear of losing, a wounded creature whose possessiveness was born not from cruelty, but from the devastating betrayal that Georgiana Crawford had inflicted upon his younger self all those years ago. Lady Harriet watched Eleanor with knowing eyes during these days of contemplation, saying little but seeing much, and when she finally spoke it was to observe that sometimes the most dangerous men were not those who openly declared their darkness, but those who hid their true natures behind charming smiles and practiced courtesies, and Eleanor understood that her employer was offering not condemnation of Alexander, but a warning about the Baron whose pale eyes still haunted her dreams. The evening of April 19th brought with it a chill that seemed to seep through the walls of Lady Harriet's townhouse despite the fires burning steadily in every grate, and Eleanor found herself standing at the window of her modest chamber, watching the last light fade from the London sky while her thoughts circled endlessly around the question that had consumed her for days, the question of whether Alexander Ravenscroft was truly the monster she had named him or something far more complicated, a man whose capacity for destruction was matched only by his capacity for devotion, and she pressed her fingertips against the cold glass as if the sensation might anchor her to some certainty in a world that had become increasingly unmoored since that first night at Hartwick House, when a dangerous duke had looked across a crowded ballroom and somehow seen her when no one else ever had. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie, and she turned to find Lady Harriet standing in the doorway, with an expression that combined concern and determination in equal measure, the elderly woman's silver hair gleaming in the candlelight as she crossed the threshold and settled herself in the small chair beside Eleanor's writing desk, with the careful movements of one whose joints protested such exertion. Lady Harriet spoke then of her own youth, of a time before her marriage to the late Lord Pembroke, when she too had been caught between duty and desire, between the safe path that society prescribed and the dangerous one that her heart demanded, and Eleanor listened with growing wonder as her employer revealed that she had once loved a man much like Alexander Ravenscroft, a man whose intensity frightened the ton and whose reputation bore the stains of violence and obsession, a man she had ultimately rejected in favor of the respectable match her family had arranged. The regret in Lady Harriet's voice was unmistakable as she confessed that she had spent 50 years wondering what might have been, that Lord Pembroke had been kind and comfortable, but had never once looked at her the way she had seen Alexander look at Eleanor, as if she were the center of the entire universe and everything else merely orbited around her presence. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as Lady Harriet reached out to take her hand, the older woman's papery skin warm despite the chill in the room, and warned her that she was not suggesting Eleanor should ignore Alexander's dangerous nature or forgive his destruction of Thomas Ashford without question, but rather that she should examine her own heart with ruthless honesty before making a decision she might spend the rest of her life regretting. The words settled into Eleanor's chest like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through every assumption she had made about her own future, about the limitations she had accepted as a widow of modest means, about the impossibility of a duke ever truly wanting someone like her for anything more than a passing fancy. And when Lady Harriet finally withdrew and left her alone with her thoughts once more, Eleanor found herself reaching for paper and pen with trembling fingers, composing a note she was not certain she would ever have the courage to send. A note that asked Alexander Ravenscroft to meet her in Hyde Park the following afternoon, so that she might finally understand the truth of his intentions. The morning of April 20th, 1814, dawned with a crystalline brightness that seemed almost cruel in its cheerfulness, the spring sunshine flooding through Eleanor's window as she dressed with trembling fingers in her familiar grey gown, the dove-coloured fabric now feeling less like armour against the world's indifference, and more like a shroud she had wrapped around herself to hide from the possibility of something more. And she tucked her mother's pearl earrings into her ears with the same careful reverence she had shown them every day since becoming a widow, drawing strength from their familiar weight as she contemplated the meeting she had arranged with a man who terrified and fascinated her in equal measure. Lady Harriet said nothing as Eleanor announced her intention to walk in Hyde Park that afternoon, though her knowing eyes conveyed volumes about her understanding of what this excursion truly meant, and she merely pressed Eleanor's hand with gentle pressure and reminded her that courage sometimes meant walking toward the very thing that frightened us most rather than fleeing into the comfortable safety of resignation. The carriage ride to the park passed in a blur of churning thoughts and rehearsed speeches, Eleanor's mind cycling through every possible outcome of this encounter, while her heart beat a rhythm against her ribs that seemed to echo Alexander's name with every pulse. And when she finally descended from the carriage, at the appointed hour, she found her legs unsteady beneath her as she made her way toward the secluded path near the Serpentine, where she had asked him to meet her away from society's prying eyes. He was already there when she arrived, standing motionless beneath the branches of an ancient oak tree whose new spring leaves cast dappled shadows across his dark coat, and the sight of him waiting for her with such obvious anticipation sent a wave of emotion through Eleanor, so powerful that she nearly turned and fled back to the safety of Lady Harriet's carriage and the quiet, predictable life she had accepted as her fate. But something held her feet to the path, some combination of Lady Harriet's words about regret and her own growing certainty that she could not spend the rest of her days wondering what might have been if only she had possessed the courage to discover whether Alexander Ravenscroft was truly capable of the love she had begun to suspect lurked beneath his dangerous exterior. He watched her approach without moving, those dark eyes that had haunted her dreams tracking her progress with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight for her body, and when she finally stopped before him close enough to see the rapid pulse beating at his throat, she realized with sudden clarity that he was just as frightened as she was, that beneath the reputation for coldness and the history of destruction lay a man who had been waiting his entire life for someone brave enough to see past the walls he had built around his wounded heart. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak the careful words she had prepared, the measured questions about his intentions and his capacity for change. But what emerged instead was something far simpler and more honest, as she heard herself asking whether he truly believed he could learn to love without destroying, whether the possessiveness that drove him to ruin other men could ever transform into something that protected rather than imprisoned. And Alexander's response was to reach out with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, and cup her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone society called a monster.